Welcome to our fifth and final class. Thanks all for coming. And as I mentioned to you last week, we're very fortunate to be joined by a guest today to offer us, I think, some very, very valuable insight into how to deliver a campaign message, not person to person and not through the news media as we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, but delivering that message online through a variety of mechanisms. And my friend Larry Eason is the CEO of a firm called .org Power. And I will simply tell you that if any of you have need for assistance in an online advocacy effort, you probably can't afford him. But if you can, this is the guy to hire. There are many, many people in the political community who pretend to know how to do this work well, but most of them are pretending. And this guy really is the gold standard, and we're very, very fortunate to have him here with us today. Before I turn over to Larry and let him share his wisdom with you, I'm going to offer you just a little bit of sort of conceptual backdrop, if you will, on the challenges and the opportunities that come with online messaging, both the similarities and, more importantly, the differences between the other types of more traditional political messaging. And first I'll offer you what I think are the three most important characteristics of online message delivery. The first, of course, is speed. And for anyone who has walked precincts or has even communicated by telephone, and certainly communicated with voters through mail, communicating a message online is immediate and therefore much faster than any other form of political communication. And that presents real opportunities, of course, because you can spread your message in real time. But there's a challenge as well, because at the same time that you're able to deliver your message as quickly as possible, that means your opponents are able to as well. And one thing we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail is how to deal with that. But I will just offer you now is that for years and years and years in working in politics, every good campaign developed what they call the rapid response operation. And that is when a message was delivered to their detriment, whether through the news media or through the mail or through person-to-person contact, there was a system in place for rebutting and responding and correcting that counter-information as quickly as possible. And one of the lessons you learned, and Larry will talk about this in more detail in a few minutes, is when it comes to online campaigning, the most rapid of rapid response isn't fast enough. And I like to say we no longer talk about reacting when it comes to political messaging, but rather pre-acting. And essentially what I'm talking about is reacting in advance. And rather than waiting for your opponent to level the charge, that is the cliche goes, can get halfway around the world before the truth puts its shoes on. You need to understand, through the process we talked about earlier in the class, the development of mirror opposite, both advantages and disadvantages, you need to be able to understand in advance the most likely criticisms your opponents are going to level with you. And rather than waiting for those criticisms to be leveled and then defend yourself, you rebut them, you diffuse them in advance. I'll give you an example. Suppose this was not Larry Eason, but it was, Gloria Romero. And she was about to deliver her presentation on how a candidate, the experiences of a candidate running for office. I would say something like, Senator Romero is a respected political leader. She's a respected leader in the education community. However, she's going to tell you some things about Proposition 28 that simply aren't true. She's going to tell you this, she's going to tell you that, she's going to tell you the other thing. But here's why those allegations are false. Senator Romero, thank you so much for coming. Then, when she offers her heartfelt but wildly inaccurate feelings about the ballot initiative, I've already inoculated myself. I've already told you in advance why what I'm going to hear from the other side isn't true. If I tell you right now, I've already, Larry was going to tell you in a few minutes why he's not very good at this. Well, I've already preset the stage. I'm not reacting, I'm pre-acting. And so when you figure out your mirror opposites, and in particular figure out your mirror opposite disadvantages, either biographical or on an issue standpoint, you think to yourself, how can I make this information public, not just quickly in response, but proactively to diminish the impact of it when that information hits. And that's most effective online, but it works in every other form as well. In particular, if you're ever debating someone, it's the best way in the world to debate them. Larry Easen's about to tell you that there's no way that the Oklahoma City Hornets can win the NBA championship. But here's why he's wrong. So when he makes those arguments, it's just going to seem a little bit less effective, because you've already heard why they're not true. So characteristic number one is speed. The second is precision. It allows you to target your message much, much more precisely than through any of the other mechanisms we talk about over the course of this class. You can target more precisely demographically. You can target more precisely geographically. But most importantly, you can target more precisely on the basis of issue interest. If you remember 2 classes ago, when we talked about the early canvassing you do, not to try to persuade voters to support your candidate, but to elicit information, to learn from them what's interesting to them. Well, with the right volunteer base, you can put together a mass of information about the voters in your district. And so when you send them an email, everybody doesn't get the email about charter schools. Everybody doesn't get the email about teacher evaluation. Everybody doesn't get the email about workforce preparedness. You're able to target your emails much, much more precisely based on the information you develop. And the third characteristic is that online communication is by far the most effective when your goal is to motivate saints. We talked about saints and sinners and salvageables a few weeks ago. We talked about the different messaging goals for each of those groups. Motivating saints, persuading salvageables, pacifying sinners. Well, there are advances being made in this field, and Larry will talk about them as well. But by far the most effective use of online messaging, whether it's on a website or by email or by social networking, the most effective utilization of any online messaging is to motivate people who already support you, to motivate and to organize and to mobilize them. And what online communication is much less effective at is persuading a salvageable voter, persuading an undecided. And the reason for that, if you think about it, is fairly straightforward. Most online communication requires a proactive decision on your part. I'm going to click on that link. I'm going to read that email. I'm going to go to my friend's Facebook page. And who's more likely to take a proactive action? A saint, somebody who already believes in what your goals are. A salvageable, somebody who's undecided, is much less likely to reach out in that regard. They're much more likely to get their information received passively. Think about it. If I'm watching television, if I'm lying on the couch watching Mad Men, and by the way, I have the last episode TiVoed, so if anybody tells me what happened, you're a dead man or woman. I'm sitting on the couch, I'm watching Mad Men, and an ad comes up. Well, I can, if the remote controls, fall in between the cushions on the couch, if I just don't do anything and sit there, that advertising message is going to wash over me. No action means I receive the message. Rather, I have to take a proactive action to avoid it. I have to change the channel. I have to get up to go to the refrigerator. I have to decide to do something to avoid the message. Whereas with most, not all, but with most online messaging, I have to make the proactive decision in order to receive it, rather than to avoid it. And as I said earlier, a saint is much more likely to take that proactive decision, rather than a salvageable. There's some challenges for online communication, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Brett, are you going to make a point?
Yeah, well, what about people who are just, they see a link that says Joe Schmo for city council, and they're like, oh, who is this? And they just click on the link. And, maybe they're just curious. That doesn't factor in at all? Or maybe To a much lesser extent, I guess?
To a much lesser extent. You'll occasionally find somebody clicking on a link out of curiosity. But if you go back to the discussion we had on the very first day of class, people don't care as much as we do. When you're aimlessly surfing the internet, the idea of randomly clicking on a website for a candidate for any office is much less likely than clicking on a link for something more likely to appeal to a normal voter. Ellie?
So I'm sorry to ask another question, but wouldn't that then be better at targeting people who do care more? So like on Facebook, you could target people who have the word politics in their profile or something like that, and you could send your ad to those people, and they might not know who you are, and may not care about, well, not necessarily care, but may not know who you are. But once they see that ad, since it, something tagged politics was in their profile, wouldn't that be a likely?
I'm going to give you a short answer, and then Larry can give you a longer one in his presentation, because I think it'll cover this from a few different places. But I'd say very briefly, Brett, and tell me if you disagree, Larry, is that once somebody puts politics in their profile, odds are they're either a saint or a sinner. Because if you remember what we talked about a few weeks ago, people who, even though there are some independent voters and some swing voters and some salvageable voters who do care very deeply about their politics and very carefully weigh both sides before coming to a decision, they're in the statistical minority. And the overwhelming majority of people who pay close attention have signed up for one team or the other. And so, unless you look more carefully at their profile, you're not going to know whether they are saints or sinners. But either way, responding in that fashion is either going to be motivating someone who's already on your side, or wasted effort for somebody who's not. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the challenges of online communication. Larry's going to get to them as well. And then finally some of the advantages and disadvantages. So at this point, after all that build-up, the second one is get out of the way, and Larry, you're on.
Thank you. There are a bunch of things I want to say in response to what you just went through, but I think I'll start with what I was going to say. So, it's great to be here. I got to do this last year. It was awesome. So thanks for inviting me. I'm going to drink a lot of coffee because I'm on East Coast time. Sorry. So I'm going to start with three very basic fundamentals, but they're crucial. And then I think I will share some thoughts and reaction in response to what you were saying. So the first is planning. The first thing you want to do when if you're running a campaign or designing a political campaign using technology and tools is to do planning. It seems so obvious, but it's a fundamental flaw of both organizational campaigns. Maybe I should step back and just say I do two different kinds of campaigns. I tend to do more issue advocacy campaigns for organizations, but I do have a fair amount of experience in candidate campaigns as well. And this is just it's such an easy thing, but to step back and figure out, what are we trying to accomplish and why, and who are our audiences, and it's a step that a lot of folks skip. And I'll give an example because we were just talking about it on the way over. But Dan and I were both involved in the Davis recall campaign, not in the recall of Davis, but in the candidates that came together after, as part of that. And my business partner and I were asked to join Ariana Huffington's team, which we did for a very short period of time, just a couple of weeks. But it was very interesting. We resigned from the campaign because our message to the campaign was, it's 100 days, something like that, and you basically have 10 days or less to make a difference, and so you need to be all over online. And there was a team of folks, wonderful, terrific people, but who have been sort of, tenured in because there was a draft Ariana effort, which some of you may or may not remember. And their plan was to build really fantastic, sophisticated web tools. And the problem with that is that that's something that takes a lot. Now today we wouldn't dream of doing that. I doubt anybody in this room. But back then, that's something that you might do, right? But in the context of a 100-day campaign, you wouldn't do that. So that's an example of where just kind of pausing and stepping back and saying, well, what's the plan? Like, what's going to help us to succeed and win